Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's July 4th weekend live from Daytona. It's about rockets, red glare, white knuckles, and blue steel. Love taps, trading paint, and taking flags. It's friends, family, and a whole lot of faith. America, start your engines. NASCAR is back on NBC. The Coke 0400 Sunday, July 5th on NBC. Coverage begins July 4th on NBCSN.
This is John Greenhut, and if your teeth are stained from coffee, tea, or smoking, Power Swabs is the answer. In 5 minutes, you'll see 2 shades whiter teeth, and in 7 days, 6 shades. Even better, there's no messy strips or trays that you'll have to leave in your mouth for an hour. Just swab your teeth for 5 minutes, and you're done. To try Power Swabs, call 1-800-679-0969. Your bright white smile will have your friends talking about how great you look. Try it risk-free. 1-800-679-0969. That's 1-800-679-0969.
Well, good afternoon. I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All. We're going to be here the next hour on this lovely sunny afternoon. Finally, after 2 or 3 days of rain, we got some beautiful weather today. I don't know how many of you are in your cars riding by our beautiful studio here in Portsmouth or Chesapeake, or I guess we're right on the border here. At K-Talk Radio, 1650 AM, I'm George Yates again. This is Justice for All. We'll be here the next hour, and we have the honor today of speaking with Lawrence Friedman. He's a law professor from Stanford University in California, of course, and he's a legal historian, probably one of the most esteemed, if not the most esteemed legal historian we have in the United States today. He's internationally renowned. He's won all sorts of literary prizes for his legal scholarship, and he's the recent author, among many books that he's already written in the past. His most famous is History of American Law, published way back in 1973. And he's now the recent author of another book, which is the subject of our show today. It's called The Big Trial: Law as Public Spectacle. So we'll be talking about that book here with Professor Friedman, Lawrence M. Friedman. How are you doing today, Professor?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me, Professor Friedman? Hello? Hello? Okay, we got a little bit of a technical difficulty here. So while we're trying to get Professor Friedman on the line here, let me tell you a little bit about this book. It's called the history of it's called The Big Trial: Law as Public Spectacle, and it's a really a phenomenal book because it covers really just about every kind of trial that is covered by the media, and trials that have been the topic of public review. I mean, we think about the O.J. Simpson trial, for instance. When you talk about a celebrity trial or a famous trial, most of us remember the O.J. Simpson trial. In fact, the book begins talking about O.J. Simpson. Seems to be the trial of the century. And then, of course, we've got the Casey Anthony trial. Many of these trials that are in this book we've actually discussed on our show with various other authors. We've talked about the O.J. Simpson trial with the trial consultant who represented O.J. Simpson in that case. We've spoken to Cheney Mason, who was the one of the defenders of Casey Anthony, the famous case in Florida, the mother charged with killing her child. These were big trials that were on TV and subject of much media review. And but the fact is that the big trial, where law has been at the center of public life, has been going on for a long time. And of course, with the rise of the print media back in the mid 19th century, and so there have been many public trials that have been the subject of a lot of attention. So Professor Friedman book here has been discusses a lot of these sort of trials, and what's fascinating about it really is if you get involved in this book and you read this book, it gets into a lot of various types of reasons why a trial becomes a big trial. Sometimes it's a political trial. Sometimes it's a trial that's basically the most celebrity trials that really, the ones that seem to attract the most attention are the ones that have sex somewhere along in it. And so you end up having this this kind of confluence of various forces. Usually you've got a celebrity, someone who's famous, and then you've got someone who's famous. You've got somebody who's got some money. You've generally got a kind of a type of a very salacious kind of it's generally about a murder, and someone's been killed, and then there's going to be a combination of factors in which somebody is now the media picks up on it, and so that's what this Professor Friedman has written this book about. So we're trying to get him on the line right now. He's a professor from Stanford University, and the book is called the Big Trial. And what we talk about a lot is, I think the most famous one what's that? We're going to go to a quick break, and we're going to get Professor Friedman on the phone right after. So stick with us.
Are you prepared to defend yourself and your family against any threat? Veteran-owned and operated One Shot Trading Post is ready to make sure that you are. Continuing training and classes on defense, survival, and weapons. Full gunsmithing services, special orders and financing available with military discounts. $15 transfers, and One Shot Trading Post is always looking to buy, sell, or trade. Located at 4366 Holland Road at South Plaza Trail, make sure that you're ready for anything at One Shot Trading Post, 463-5893, OneShotTradingPost.com.
We talk about it all the time on the show. Are you safe and secure online? Are you private? Leo Laporte here, the tech guy. Well, I've always said if you're on the internet, you're in public, but there are things you can do to protect yourself a little bit. You certainly should know what the risks are. We talk about that each and every week, plus all the latest news, gossip, and tech support. It's coming up this weekend right here with me, Leo Laporte, the tech guy.
Saturdays 8 p.m., Sundays 6 p.m. on K-Talk 1650.
Okay, we're back with Justice for All, and this time we do have Professor Lawrence Friedman on the line. We'll try one more time. Can you hear me now, Professor?
How are you?
Hello, we have you now, sir?
Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Listen, I got a chance to read your book, The Big Trial, and my first question to you is you make a comment that these trials are what they call didactic theater, and of course, that's one of those 50-cent words that I'm not sure I know what that means. What do you mean by didactic theater?
Well, you know what theater means, so we can start with that. So didactic means educational, really. It's a fancy word for something that educates or points a moral. And the idea is that each of these trials, it becomes famous, makes headlines for some reason. It's got a message. There's a message. The message can be subtle. You have to read between the lines. But there always is a message. And what I do is I trace the message more or less from, roughly, I make a few comments about earlier stuff, but mostly it's 19th and 20th century.
Right. Well, you cover the thing that, once again, we're talking about this book, The Big Trial, which it's just out. It's a 2015 copyright on it. But what's fascinating is really you go to your footnote section. You cover so many trials in the book that I don't even know where to start. You seem to talk about the Lizzie Borden trial. When I was a child, what was it? Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her parents 40 whacks. Yeah. I guess that seems to be the one we start with, right? Isn't that kind of your first big celebrity trial or big?
Well, in some ways, it's one of the most famous trials in U.S. history. In fact, a month after my own book came out, a new book about the Lizzie Borden case just appeared. And you could fill a library with books about the case. There's also been an opera, a ballet. So you have to say, now, what was it about this case that made it so famous? I mean, there are all these, it's a murder case, but okay, we have how many thousand murders a year. what was it that made Lizzie Borden so famous? And why is it, Lizzie Borden took an axe? Why is it that kids still recite this little ditty? They don't know what it means.
No.
And
well, tell us what it means. Why is Lizzie Borden why does it still fascinate us today?
That's the question. But before I do that, I just want to make one small point, is that I classify these big trials into about 10 or 11 categories. But you can divide them into two kind of really big categories, political trials and non-political trials. So Lizzie Borden is a non-political trial. It has nothing to do with politics, with the government, etc. It was just a plain murder trial, and it happened in 1892. And the Bordens were the leading family, or one of the leading families of Fall River, Massachusetts. It was August, it was hot. So Mr. Borden, Andrew Borden, he lived in this big house, and he had a wife. She was his second wife. First wife died. And he had two daughters, Lizzie and Emma. And the two daughters were in their 30s. They weren't married. They were pillars of the community. They were church-going. They were probably, this is the 1890s, very unlikely they had any sexual experience. They were what we would call spinsters, but they were active in this was a leading family. And on this day, in August 1892, Mr. Borden and his wife were brutally, savagely, in broad daylight murdered. Their heads were bashed in with a hatchet. And the only people in the house at the time were Lizzie and an Irish maid, Bridget. And let's forget Bridget for a number of reasons. So suspicion falls on Lizzie Borden. And mind you, this is a remarkably brutal murder. Now, of course, if there had been a brutal murder in the slums of New York or something, they might have made a paragraph.
Right.
But the Lizzie Borden trial attracted reporters from all over the country. This is, of course, before radio or television. But the newspapers were there. Foreign newspapers were represented. The trial was sensational. Why? And why has it kept its fascination? You can go to Fall River. The house is now a bed and breakfast, and they have some kind of, I think, thing on Halloween. Who knows? But it's still famous. And so why? And the reason is because of Lizzie. Because the question in that trial was, how could this kind of woman do this kind of act? So there's a very good essay written by a former student of mine, Kara Robertson, on the Lizzie Borden case. And the more recent book does this too, is that society was on trial. I mean, the jury was asked to find that a church-going, upper-class woman, unmarried, would have done this kind of sick, pathological deed. Just murdered her own father and her stepmother. Of course, that's another story. And the jury simply refused to believe it. They simply, the evidence was pretty strong, but they would not believe it. They acquitted her.
So what was the evidence? So she was acquitted by the jury.
Yeah, she was acquitted. Well,
what was the evidence against her?
Well, first of all, there was simply the fact of who else. There was nobody in the house. We can forget the Irish maid for various reasons. There was talk about strangers, but nobody came into the house. And her behavior was very peculiar. She gave very conflicting statements at the inquest. She was seen burning a dress. Why? In a blazing hot day. Why was she burning a dress? She had gone to a drugstore a week earlier and tried to buy some poison. There were a number of things that cast suspicion on her. But I think most of all that she really didn't have a good story. Where was she at the time? Well, I was in the barn. I was eating pears. Well, I was upstairs. I mean, she was tangled up, and again, when you come right down to it, who else? Now, why would she have done it? Now, that's the question. I mean, that was the question that really bothered the jury. Why? How could you attribute this to a woman of this kind? Now, actually, today we're much more cynical and callous, and we can say very good reason. She was a prisoner there. He was a tough, stingy old man. She had no life. She had no money. He was rich, but he doled out pennies to her and her sister. She killed, let's assume she did it, she killed the stepmother first. If she had killed her father first, then the stepmother would have inherited money from him. But the stepmother was killed first. And then Mr. Borden. So all of his money, the house, everything went to the two daughters. And they were free. But this is something that today this says, well, there's a motive, but at the time, believable.
Well, isn't that, and isn't that so? You do discuss that in your book, Was Justice Done? And you kind of, you talk about how some of these trials, are mysteries kind of in their own sense. We as spectators, we're trying to decide, did they do it or didn't they do it? And even at the end, when the jury acquits or convicts, there's always this question in the public's mind, did they really do it? Was justice done?
Yeah, so that's another aspect. It's the mystery involved. So in the Lizzie Borden case, you not only have the mystery, who did this? You also have the mystery of who is she? Let's assume she did it. Who is she? On the surface, she looks like the perfect woman. She goes to church. She's active in charity. She has friends. She dresses properly. She has no criminal background, of course. So the jury is asked to find that underneath there's a seething mass of pathology. So there's a lot of other cases which are fascinating simply because they're so mysterious.
Well, and you discuss a lot of cases involving what they call the unwritten law. Tell us about the cases of the unwritten law, which you've written about in the past in some essays. And what's the unwritten law? And is there still an unwritten law?
The answer to that is no, there is not. So let me just talk briefly about that. The first really big case involving the so-called unwritten law involved a congressman from New York named Daniel Sickles. So Daniel Sickles had been elected to Congress, and he moved to Washington, D.C. This is in the 1850s. And he has a young, pretty wife named Teresa. So one day he receives an anonymous letter. We still don't know who sent it. It said, your wife, Teresa, she's having an affair. She goes to a house, and she has sex with a man named Philip Barton Key. Now, actually, if you're a trivia lover, Philip Barton Key was a lawyer. He was the son of the Francis Scott Key who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. So anyway, Congressman Sickles calls his wife in, and he says, what? I have this letter. She bursts into tears, and she confesses, yes, it's true. So the next day, he takes his gun, and he goes and he finds Philip Barton Key on the streets of Washington, D.C., and he fills him full of lead. So he's arrested, he's charged with murder, and he's put on trial. I mean, there's no question about the facts. He shot in cold blood. Victim, Philip Barton Key, is dead. Okay, so Philip Barton Key was sleeping with his wife, but you could search the penal code of the District of Columbia till you're blue in the face. You're not going to find that that's an excuse for murder. The jury acquits like in a flash because of what comes to be called the unwritten law. That is, if you kill your wife's lover, that's fine. No jury will convict you. And throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century, this is, in fact, the norm. And newspapers talk about it. And the lawyers who defend these people, they bring it up. they talk about the Bible and the adulterer must die, but of course it's not American law. But it's the jury's unwritten law. So that's the unwritten law. And it's interesting, there's a female version. And the female version is women who are acquitted if they kill an abusive husband or lover. And notice that, getting back to the original Dan Sickles type of unwritten law, notice that the woman is never harmed. And not only did he not harm his wife, Teresa, he took her back, which kind of shocked some people. But the woman is defined as a victim.
Yeah, the woman is being held up as having no role in it whatsoever. She's the victim of this evil...
This evil seducer, this cad who tricked her, blah, blah, blah. And
this was part of our... Would you say this is part of our Victorian notions as to the purity of women?
Exactly. Women are innocent, naive. They're easily fooled. They're easily seduced by evil men. But okay, we know there are such things as prostitutes. But if we talk about respectable women like Teresa Sickles, married to a congressman, it must have been all his fault. Now, that's the reason why we don't have this today, is because today people say, well, who are you kidding? It takes two to tango.
Right.
But that was not a Victorian notion.
Right. Well, in fact, the lawyers would get up in front of the juries and say things like, it's the duty of the cuckolded husband to go out and kill this fellow.
Right. Yeah, any man with any self-respect, et cetera, it's part of his manhood. So, today, the reason why you don't have it today, it's not that there isn't, that the violence of this type doesn't occur, but a jury would say, well, first of all, why don't you get a divorce, for God's sakes? Or just get rid of her, and what's the big deal here anyway?
Right.
So although it's possible for a jury to sympathize with the guy, they couldn't buy the same kind of Victorian arguments. And so one of the things in my book, which I tried to do, is to show how these social notions, as they change the way these trials come out and the way they're dealt with and what they mean. And so that's one of the themes of the book.
If you've just joined us, I'm with Professor Lawrence Friedman. He's the author of The Big Trial, Law as Public Spectacle. We're going to go to a short break here in just a minute, Professor.
Okay.
But I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All. But quickly, we talk about, we've got just a minute here. You talk about how the men have a duty to go out and kill, and they, at least back under the unwritten law. But you also discuss in your book how often women were able to get away with murder of their husbands, and is that and you discussed that in the unwritten law towards women too.
Yeah.
How often was that successful, and why can't they still use that today? Don't women still get away with saying, "Oh, well, he abused me, and therefore I'm killing him out of some kind of PTSD or something like that," or the burning bed? I remember that back in the day.
Yeah, but I have to. I don't want to offend the women who are listening. Get away with it kind of implies something that I wouldn't want to imply.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Today we have what's called the battered wife or battered woman syndrome, in which these women who are victims and they're afraid of the guy. They can't say, well, why don't they run away? Well, some do to a shelter, but the guy says, I'll find you and I'll get you. And so they wait till he's asleep, let's say, and then they bash his head in or kill him. And juries have been very sympathetic to that, and that's actually considered a form of self-defense.
Yes. We used to call that Virginia Beach divorce. But we're going to go to a short break, and I'd like to discuss that just a little bit when we return. We're with Professor Lawrence Friedman. I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
Are you prepared to defend yourself and your family against any threat? Veteran-owned and operated One-Shot Trading Post is ready to make sure that you are. Continuing training and classes on defense, survival, and weapons. Full gunsmithing services, special orders and financing available with military discounts. $15 transfers, and One-Shot Trading Post is always looking to buy, sell, or trade. Located at 4366 Holland Road at South Plaza Trail, make sure that you're ready for anything at One-Shot Trading Post. 463-5893, OneShotTradingPost.com.
We talk about it all the time on the show. Are you safe and secure online? Are you private? Leo Laporte here, the tech guy. Well, I've always said if you're on the internet, you're in public, but there are things you can do to protect yourself a little bit. You certainly should know what the risks are. We talk about that each and every week, plus all the latest news, gossip, and tech support. It's coming up this weekend right here with me, Leo Laporte, the tech guy.
Saturdays 8 p.m., Sundays 6 p.m. on K-Talk 1650.
RM Designs T-shirt printing and more is located in Smithfield, but serves all of Hampton Roads. They specialize in vinyl design shirts, apparel, window stickers, cups, and other specialty gifts. They also have rhinestone and embroidery designed apparel, and they offer Pandora-style beads and hardware to create a one-of-a-kind piece of jewelry. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more caters to businesses, sports teams, churches, groups, and family reunions. They also offer a great fundraising package should you be in need of money for a special project. And they also do home parties if you and your friends would like to get together and make your own creations. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more can be reached at 757-255-9140. That's 757-255-9140. Email them at rmdesigns11@aol.com or find them on Facebook at RM Twisted Designs. You can also place orders directly off their store at storeenvy.com/RM Twisted Designs.
Leaky faucet, refinishing old countertops? Hey, Gary Sullivan here. Perhaps you're restaining a deck or painting your living room. Whatever it is, let me help. I'm here to give you the tips you need to finish those pesky projects you've been putting off. If you're restaining, have a tip for that. Can't get the paint off the hardwood floors? Got a tip for that too. I'm here to make sure that $5 repair doesn't turn into a $500 repair. Join me right here every weekend.
Saturdays at noon, Sundays at 9 a.m. on AM 1650 WHKT, The Answer.
All right, we're back. I'm George Yates with Professor Lawrence Friedman regarding his book, The Big Trial, Law as Public Spectacle. Before we move on to political trials, the unwritten law, which still fascinates me, and there's a continuing theme throughout your book, it seems, about how some of these big trials were there to protect the elite reputations and to somehow keep the order of social, the social caste system in America. Tell us a little bit about that. And you talk about that with the Fatty Arbuckle case and some of these celebrity trials. And, of course, the Lizzie Borden case there's a theme, isn't there, for some of these trials?
Yeah, well, Lizzie Borden is a very clear case. Another was the trial of Sam Sheppard in the 1950s. I mean, these are trials in which elites are on trial. So, I mean, the result...
That book, wasn't that the basis for the Fugitive TV show and the movie?
Yeah,
Sam Sheppard?
I don't know that that's ever been proven, but that's very often said. And unlike Lizzie Borden, Dr. Sam is probably, or almost certainly, was innocent, although he was convicted.
And did he serve time? I mean,
yes, he did serve time.
It was 10 years before that case was overturned.
Yeah, it was overturned in the Supreme Court, which said that the trial had been a media circus, and then he was acquitted on retrial, but by that time he was kind of a wreck, and he didn't live very much longer after that.
Right.
But his son, he had a son who's been fighting ever since to prove that he was innocent, and he's done a pretty good job of showing that, actually showing who did the crime. But the reason that I mentioned in the same breath as Lizzie Borden is that it was similar in that Dr. Sam Sheppard was a leading citizen. He was an osteopath, lived in a well-to-do suburb, and it was the same general question. Is it possible that this guy, this pillar of society, murdered his pregnant wife? So these are cases which put in question the elites of society.
Well, isn't that what many defense lawyers will do? I know I'm a criminal defense attorney, and isn't it often the role of the defense lawyer? And I know it was done in O.J. Simpson successfully, and that is to paint a picture of this guy, regardless of the evidence, ladies and gentlemen. This guy just isn't the type of guy that would commit this kind of crime.
Yes.
Isn't that what's done a lot?
Yeah, it's unthinkable. Like Lizzie, it's unthinkable. And look, what makes these trials so fascinating very often is that air of mystery. I compare them to, I say they're theater, but when you go to a theater, you see one play, one plot. When you have a big trial like this, there are two plots. The prosecution has a plot, and the defendant has a plot, and they're wildly different.
But the media has their own plot.
And they have their own plot.
There's three plots.
That often happens. But there's at least two. And the question is, which one is the truth? And the sad fact is we never get to know. One of the cases I mentioned is Klaus von Bülow.
Wow, famous case.
Famous case. And we don't know to this day. Did he or didn't he? That he was
charged with poisoning his wife?
Injecting something in his wife to put her into a coma. She was still alive at the time of the trial. She lasted in the kind of vegetative state for years and years. And her children, who were his stepchildren, and a maid of hers were just convinced that he was an evil guy and that he had done this to her. And the defense claimed that, medically that was ridiculous, and she might have done it herself. She was kind of a sicko. And we just don't know to this day.
And what was the jury verdict on the von Bülow case?
Well, he got off.
Right.
But, there's, everybody knows about beyond a reasonable doubt. Excuse me. So sometimes, if you ask the jury, they would say, well, basically, we kind of think he probably did it, but, it wasn't proven. But you see, there is a case in which he was the question is, who is he? And another point that I make in the book is that in all of these cases, there's an issue of identity. That is, who is this? Lizzie Borden, who is she? Is she this church-going woman, or is she a pathological killer? Klaus von Bülow, is he just kind of this slick playboy, or is he somebody who would do this to his poor wife?
Right. And
that identity issue is the one thing that holds all of these cases have in common.
Right. I mean, like Phil Spector and supposedly the murder that took place there in his mansion in Los Angeles, where he was tried and then the hung jury and all of that, and then tried again. Who is he? What kind of a person was Phil Spector?
So there was actually a case which wasn't well known outside of my area, but it took place about 2 blocks from my house where I now live, in the 1930s. And there's this guy, he worked for the Stanford University Press, and he had a wife, and he had a kid who was actually off with grandma on this particular day. He comes out in the morning, and he's chatting up his neighbor, and he goes back in the house, and he starts yelling, "Oh, my God." So it turns out his wife is dead. She's in the bathroom, blood all over the place. And the police, this is before modern forensic medicine, the police decide he killed her. Why is she there dead with all this blood? And he said, no, it must have been some wild accident. So he was tried 3 times. And once he was convicted, and that was reversed because the California Supreme Court said, we don't think there's enough evidence. There was a hung jury. Finally, the prosecution gave up. But there's no answer. No motive, no mistress, no reason to think they weren't happily married. And yet, there are people who insisted, look, it had to be murder. No one else was in the house, and it couldn't have been an accident. And to be perfectly honest, I had a student who I said, go over every scrap of evidence. the court records and so on.
You went back and researched this case from 1930.
And so she came back, she says, I don't know. We'll never know. So this adds an air of mystery to a lot of these, as like a mystery story, who done it. And in fact, in every mystery story, and do I dare put in a plug for myself?
Sure.
I have another occupation. I also write mysteries under my own name. They're on Amazon if you want to look at them. But I'm fascinated by it. I've also written some stuff about the history of the mystery story.
Well, and you talk about that in your book,
yes,
how
I
the
do.
rise of these big trials, the rise of the mass media, certainly in the mass print media, and the rise of the murder mystery. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you see, it's interesting because you can't trace murder mysteries back past Edgar Allan Poe. As the first half of the 19th century. And what I argue is that you start getting a modern society, and in modern societies, identity becomes an issue in a way that it wasn't before. Another small example has to be bigamy. You see, there's an outburst of bigamy cases in the 19th century. Now just imagine some little village somewhere, traditional village. Everybody knows everybody. So a guy can't marry two women because they say you're already married. But you come to the U.S., an immigrant comes, leaves a wife behind, or he lives in New Hampshire and then he says, well, let's move to Ohio, and he gets to Ohio, he says, oh, I'm a bachelor. So it's the mobility that makes it possible for you to pretend to be something that you're not. And the essence of all mystery stories is somebody, we don't find out till the last chapter, is pretending to be something they're not.
Mm-hmm.
And so the same kind of identity mystery that lies at the base of these thousands of novels, Agatha Christie and Dashiell Hammett and whatnot, and John Grisham, is at the basis of many of these trials. Who is this?
Yeah, you could have the crooked cop that, all along he's investigating it, and you think he's the good guy. It turns out in the end that he's the bad guy.
Right. And, you have O.J. Simpson, really famous trial. So the prosecution says, this guy he beats his wife, and then he gets insanely jealous. He's a killer. And the defense says, no, he's not. Somebody else. This is a sports hero, a member of the Hall of Fame. And so the question is, who is he?
Yeah.
And it's up to the jury to decide. But even after they decide, of course, especially in that case, they didn't satisfy everybody. Far from it.
No. And ultimately, of course, he was convicted in the civil trial and then convicted later. I could go 2 hours with you easy, Professor, so I'm having to move you along.
Sure.
You talk about political and non-political. Yeah. Talk about some of the political trials. Political trials aren't as sexy as these other ones, are they? But but they still are important from a society standpoint. Tell us about.
They're very important,
right.
and they may be, who's to say what's more important? But they don't have the blood and guts.
Or the
but
sex.
They have a political meaning. So, for example, the trial of the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So they're accused of giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. They were convicted and executed. So this is a trial. This is a political trial par excellence.
Because Ethel wasn't guilty at all, I don't believe.
Well,
in retrospect, we look back at it.
In retrospect, it seems she wasn't, but he probably was. But then also there's a lot of controversy over how important was the stuff they transferred.
And it wasn't.
Apparently not. But, this is...
The Russians later on said that they never used it. They never could have used it anyway. It wasn't even important.
But see, this comes out of a whole period of the Cold War.
Right.
And the government is using these trials to give a message. And the message is, we have a dangerous enemy, and we have to be on the alert. We have to punish people. country is riddled with spies and fellow travelers. So that's a message that they're giving. And the political trials, I'm not saying that the trials are unfair, because I think many of them are scrupulously fair. And I mentioned the trial of Judith Kaplan, for instance. Judith Kaplan worked for the government, and during this period, she fell in love with some Russian guy, and she gave him papers. She was guilty, but she never went to prison because there were procedural flaws, and the courts just let her go. It isn't that they sympathized with her or they thought she was innocent, but she never served a day. And I think she later, I can't remember what I said, I think she later just ran a restaurant in New York. So I'm not saying these trials are unfair. Many of them are scrupulously fair, but they're brought for a purpose. And then I also talk about the fact that sometimes it's the defense which is trying to make its political point. That they'll say, okay, for instance, during the Vietnam War, we'll try the war. You're accusing us of burning draft records or draft dodging. Fine. We're not even going to argue that. We're going to argue that the war is immoral and unjust, and we're going to do all kinds of shenanigans in court. So they magnify the political meaning. They try to hijack the political meaning of the trial. Now, in other countries, like the Soviet Union and even today in Putin's Russia, I mean, these trials are grossly unfair and are used to suppress opposition. So political trials are also meant to suppress the opposition, but presumably only when the opposition has done something which is criminal. Otherwise, not.
At least our trials, even though they may be political, they do have, as you say, they're fair. They have their, whereas in Russia, there's a clear perception that they're not fair.
They're not fair.
We had a guest on our show several months back, Bill Browder, who wrote a book called Red Notice. Mm-hmm. He was a co-defendant with Gregor Magnitsky, who you discuss was convicted and then tortured and killed in prison in Russia. Yeah. He was the lawyer that really was uncovering tax fraud in Russia, along with Browder. Browder was sent back to London and denied a visa to come back in the country. He was an American, and they convicted him in absentia and convicted Magnitsky and ended up torturing him. And that was a political prosecution in Putin's Russia. Tell us a little bit about those kinds of prosecutions.
Well, those are the most famous ones are the purge trials under Stalin, in which he got people to confess that they were working for the counter-revolutionary forces and so on. They were phony from start to finish. And then the question really is why bother? I mean, Stalin was perfectly capable of just arresting people and having them executed. But they wanted to give a message to the public that this is what happens to you if you run afoul of the administration.
Right.
But I want to correct something. I don't want to suggest that all of our political trials, I don't want to sound Pollyannish, because many of our political trials have been very controversial. The death penalty for the Rosenbergs was controversial.
Right.
But probably the most controversial was the Sacco-Vanzetti case.
Right. Tell us about that. You talk about that. If you've just joined us, I'm with Lawrence Friedman, and it is a great book. I guess it's on sale right now. You can get this book on Amazon.
Right.
And if you like law and cases, and what I really loved about this book, Professor, is that if you have any interest in any of these trials, you cover so many different trials, some in more detail, and the book is so beautifully footnoted that if you have any interest in any of these trials, you just go to the back and it gives you sources so that you can go read more about any of these trials. So a very good work of scholarship. If of course you're probably the best in the country at it. But tell us about Sacco. That's a great trial. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Sacco-Vanzetti case. This was in Massachusetts, and Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants, and they were anarchists, and they were accused of robbery and murder. And the trial became a real cause célèbre. They were convicted and sentenced to death. And there's a lot of evidence the trial was grossly unfair. The judge was prejudiced, and they were really, the accusation, which was made by a lot of prominent attorneys, law professors, judges, was that this was a political trial. So in form, it was they were just accused of having robbed and murdered, but in fact, they were put on trial because they were foreigners, they were aliens, and they were anarchists. They were a danger to the United States of America. And the trial was just incredibly famous and controversial. It just split society into two halves, those who thought they were guilty and those that thought they were innocent and were being railroaded. And I think the evidence is very strong that the trial was quite unfair. The judge was prejudiced. And as to whether they were actually guilty of anything, that's never been established. And I guess the most scholars think that at least one of them was completely innocent.
And they were executed, both of them, right?
They were executed, yeah. And there was a huge campaign to save their lives. Foreigners got into the act. I mean, letters and statements poured in from all over the world to spare their lives, but it was no use, and they were executed. And, so they're considered martyrs to a cause in many circles.
And that's still a famous case, right? I mean,
Sacco
Vanzetti still reverberates today, doesn't it?
Yeah. And there have been controversies. I mentioned this somewhere. Controversies are whether the state of Massachusetts should apologize or should declare that they were innocent all along and so forth. But people still argue about the case. It's a case that it's like Lizzie Borden. It never dies. I mean, it's still being talked about. There are other cases which are still being talked about simply because they were somehow so captivated the imagination, like the trial of Harry K. Thaw for killing Stanford White, and that's been on TV. The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, and so on. I mean, this is still something that people talk about.
Tell us about that one. There was a movie on that, wasn't there? A movie made about that?
Yeah, I think so, and there's certainly been a lot written about it. So the victim there was a man named Stanford White, who was the leading architect. This is around the 1900s. He was the country's most famous architect. He designed all kinds of famous buildings in New York. And the allegation, there was this woman named Evelyn Nesbit, and she was famously beautiful. She had been a chorus girl at 16, a Floridora girl. She was ravishingly beautiful. And she married a guy named Harry Thaw, who was a millionaire, but mentally quite unstable. And she told him that when she was 16, she had been raped by Stanford White, that he drugged her, took her to his apartment, and raped her. And so Thaw went out, and he went to Madison Square Garden, where there was a show going on. Stanford White was there, and he just shot him. So this was a kind of unwritten law case, except that, it wasn't as if White was currently involved with...
And they weren't married at the time, so it wasn't a husband out avenging his...
He was just avenging her, and he was mentally unstable. He ended up in an asylum. But anyway, she was the centerpiece of the trial because she was so beautiful, and there.
Now, how do you capture that? This is before the era of cameras in the courtroom.
But it's not before the era of photography.
Right. Okay.
And there were people who could draw her picture, but she'd been on the stage, so she was known as this sensational beauty. And the victim was the most famous architect in the U.S.
So what did the jury do with that one?
Well, that went through a number of iterations. There was a hung jury. That he also was found not guilty of reasonable insanity. He ended up in an asylum. He escaped. I mean, he was clearly unbalanced, but she was the focus of this trial. This was, everyone was interested in her, and these movies and the TV thing, which I've never seen, but I've heard about it, called The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. Supposedly he had this swing in his apartment, Stanford White, and he brought the women up there, and he gave them drugged them with liquor and so forth. Who knows how much of that was true? I mean, she tells that story. She wrote her memoirs later, but, we don't know whether to believe her or not.
So the theme of these celebrity trials always needs to, either the victim or the defendant or some character in it is usually there's got to be some beauty in it, or some money,
yes.
or an elite. It's generally got to be murder, and there's got to be sex involved, and there's a combination. Once you put those,
yes. Once you put them together, sex, murder, celebrity, you get something really dramatic. And so let me just mention
it's entertainment.
It is entertainment. Yes, people are entertained. The Fatty Arbuckle case. So Roscoe Arbuckle was a comedian, director, one of the Hollywood stars. He was a fat guy. He was a comedian. He wasn't a romantic lead. And he had this party, and a young woman at the party got ill and eventually died. And the allegation was that he had done something, raped her or something, and that's why she died. And the newspapers, there's a case in which the media really made this into something much bigger than it was. That there was some orgy, a wild party. It was vastly exaggerated. There was drinking. It was during Prohibition, so that was illegal, but everybody was doing it. And it was hardly an orgy. And it's very dubious as to whether Arbuckle did anything to her. When she was dying, she said something like, "He hurt me." But it's not clear what she meant by that. Maybe when he was trying to help her. Or maybe he really wanted to have sex with her but never did. But at any rate, she died of causes that are hard to attribute to him. At any rate, there were this whole series of trials, and finally he was acquitted. But by that time, his career was utterly ruined, and he died shortly thereafter. But it's not only the air of mystery, but the kind of combination of sex and celebrity and Hollywood. And people like to read about it to feel that there's this sort of wild debauchery going on, this world that's so distant from the world of the average humdrum human being. And that's what fascinated them. But, in that case, it's very unclear as to whether there was any substance behind it.
Well, your book is fascinating, and I wish I could go a whole nother hour with you, Professor Friedman. But I'll tell you what, for those listeners out there, you need to. This is just only the tip of the iceberg of this book, and the different trials that we have touched on some of the more famous ones that are in the book, but there are many, many more. We talked about the worm in the bud and all that sort of stuff that we won't be able to get to in the show today. But I'd like to thank you, Professor Friedman, for being on Justice for All today.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Well, that concludes our show today with Professor Lawrence M. Friedman. The book was The Big Trial, Laws of Public Spectacle. I'm glad we were finally able to get him on the air. We had a little technical difficulties in the beginning, and you really did need this. I could go in easily another hour with him. There's so many different cases that he covered. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to, before we go, tell everybody that we're sponsored by Bayside Harley-Davidson. So if you want to pick up a motorcycle and you're riding out there on 264 right next to our studio, just keep on rolling right there and talk to Joey Fletcher, who's the general manager. And also on my way home, I'm going to stop by my favorite butcher shop in Hilltop West in Virginia Beach, the Village Butcher, family owned and operated. And so go on in there to Village Butcher before 6 o'clock today, because they're closed on Sundays, and pick yourself up some ribs or some some other fine fine grass-fed beef for your grilling pleasure on this Saturday evening. Thank you for joining me. I'm George Yates. This is Justice for All. Join us next Saturday at 2 o'clock. Have a great day.